we now welcome Arlene as our guest chair for the next two presentations.
Sorry.
Arlene, welcome. I mean, many of you
Yes,
will.
you can hear me?
We
can. You hear me all right?
I'm just going to introduce you. Many of you will know Arlene. Arlene has been a leading light on noise issues for decades now, and is one of the most respected figures in the United States. So it's great to have you with us, Arlene.
Thank you, and thank you for this conference and for inviting me, John and Dermot. I'm going to be introducing Tim Johnson, who's the director of the Aviation Environment Federation, which is a UK NGO campaigning group that looks at aviation impacts on people and the environment. He's also the lead representative of the International Coalition for Sustainable Aviation, which represents the society organizations at the International Civil Aviation Organization. And as part of that group, he has led a number of individuals on drafting emission unit eligibility criteria. And he is also in the UK, he sits on the Department of Transport's Jet Zero Control. And the talk he will be giving is titled The Best Metrics to Use. So I turn you over to Mr. Tim Johnson. Thank you, Tim.
So thank you so much for the introduction, and thank you for the invitation to come and speak to you this afternoon. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening to you in different time zones. It's great to see some of you after a long time. John, we get to see each other from time to time, but Dominique, Marco, some of our members, lovely to see your faces today. So we had the introduction a little bit about what I do, but just to sort of make it clear, I'm from an environmental NGO, and we were formed in the 1970s in the UK because communities wanted a voice in national policy making, and they wanted, it was almost too much for governments to engage with each airport community. They wanted an organisation that could act on their behalf, and that was the origins of the AEF. And we've developed this role not just in UK policy, but internationally, because, as you all know, so many of the solutions to aviation's problems are not just domestic, or maybe look at it a different way. Governments are reluctant to act domestically, and hence we have this international role. And we're really pleased to work with UECNA and Dominique as part of ICSA when it comes to looking at ICAO and what ICAO can do. And obviously you heard from Dominique this morning about that work program. So my title today, it's quite an ominous one really, was to come up with the best metric. I'm going to start with this. This is not the latest plan for a green airport. This is my allotment. So I became an allotment holder during lockdown, during the COVID pandemic. I'm very proud of my allotment and of my vegetable growing, but I'm also a novice. And I spend a lot of time within the allotment community talking to other people, my neighbours that have been doing this for a long time, have a lot of experience. And I want to ask them, for example, what's the best onion that I can grow? And what I want is for them all to give me the same answer. That would give me confidence that this was the crop that I should be going. But actually the answers I get varied, and they're so wide, not just one or two varieties, but many varieties. Plant them in autumn, plant them in the spring, water it this way, feed it that way. And all I really wanted to know was just that simple thing, but which one should I start with? Where do I make a start? But I suspect that in many ways, they're all right, that these are crops that have grown well for them in varying circumstances or in varying conditions. They're the right crop for them, and it appeals to their taste or their expectations. So none of them are wrong. And whilst I was at my allotment, I was thinking today about this presentation. It struck me that I think noise in many ways is very similar. What is the best noise metric? Well, I don't want to issue a spoiler, but I suspect rather like what's the best onion question, there is no single answer. It varies enormously. So I'm not going to sort of spend this time going through all the metrics and reviewing them and trying to look at what works and what doesn't work. But I'm going to try and look at overall at what is it that we want. Perhaps a better starting point is not what's the best metric, but what's the best question that we as community groups should be asking. What is it that we want to know? That should be the starting point. Now, I suspect for many people, that first question is not, neither do I think it is the second, third, or even the fourth question that they would ask. I suspect the question is not this. It is not, please tell me the average noise exposure, smoothing out the peaks and troughs in sound energy to represent a continuous sound level, representative of an average operational day that I'm unlikely to ever experience in reality. That is not the question that anyone, I think, in the community, any one of you, would make your top ask. And yet, that's really what we are presented with. This is the accepted wisdom. It's the basis for lots of policy documents, you know, whether it's LEQ or the weighted variants of that, the LDNs or the LDENs. You know, that's not the sort of question that we have in mind. Now, I'm not dismissing for 1 minute the use of average noise contours. You know, they have some very important uses. Measuring changes over time, land use planning, summarizing sort of area-wide changes when you have flight path or proposed airport expansions, and health-based research. I mean, picking up on some of the things that Marco's been seeing, much of the health-based research is correlated to the use of LEQ and its derivatives. So that's where our evidence base is. And you know, like some of the questions we've just had, we want to move that sort of health-based research into the forefront of policy considerations. And if we're going to actually start changing metrics at this stage, we would have to go back and recalibrate all those results. So they certainly have their use in that way. I should say, actually, in the UK at the moment, we're about to commission a new sort of dose effect survey of annoyance. And whilst respondents are going to be selected on the basis of the noise contours they live in, it would be a good idea, we think, once they've been selected, to calculate other single event metrics. And therefore, when you cross-cut the data at the end, you'll be able to get far more out of that than just the traditional sort of dose effect curve. You'll also be able to look at questions like number and maybe time of day and other sort of sensitivities. I don't think it's a lot more work because, you know, it's the same noise data you're working with, a little bit more effort. I appreciate that in terms of actually trying to provide those additional noise bases, but we can start building a new health-based evidence along the lines of several metrics and not just one. But certainly, I say I'm not dismissing the use of average contours. Even, you know, Dominique's presentation at the beginning and the work of ICAO, you know, as we start to think about a new stringency, so what comes after Chapter 14 in terms of aircraft noise certification, the way we do that in ICAO is we identify a number of stringency levels, and then there is a database of populations around airports around the globe. And we make assumptions about how those stringencies would filter into the fleet, how that would play out at those airports. And we can come up with a global exposure, global noise exposure, and we can show how those increases in stringencies affect the global noise environment. So certainly for that, they have their place, but they are really metrics for policymakers, and they're metrics for planners. They don't tell you about your individual experience at a particular location. In fact, for some communities, perhaps, they unintentionally mislead. We have several airports in the UK that are limited by a never exceed noise contour. Now, I think that means something to communities. To communities, they mean that, the noise level at a given threshold will not exceed that given area. And, they want to have faith and confidence in it. But in reality, because it's calculated using an average LEQ, the noise is frequently exceeded on a daily basis. We have one particular member at a business aviation airport in the UK where movements are very much focused on Monday to Friday. The weekend is relatively quieter, and it is governed by a maximum noise contour. But once you average the weekend and the weekday traffic together, the noise contour is representative of something that they don't really experience Monday to Friday. The noise is much higher. And so in a sense, people don't have confidence in those sort of metrics because they're not doing what they set out to try. Now, there are ways that we all know where metrics can perhaps overcome those problems. If because they're often representative of a mix of, for example, easterly and westerly operations, you could do 100% single mode contours. You could do contours when operations are just on westerlies, or if they are just on easterlies. You could break it up into smaller time intervals. You could create worst case scenarios. You could look at the weightings that we see in LDN and LDEN. And you can also look at perhaps the sort of, the sort of background noise levels and contrast them to show the degree of intrusion. So, I'm certainly not saying that they don't have their place, but it is accepted wisdom, and the question really is it useful communities? The questions that we want to know, I think, are far more locational specific, far more simplistic. How many aircraft are over me? When are they over me? How loud are they? And again, how intrusive are they given background noise levels? Now, this is hardly new thinking. I don't think I need to tell you that. And we've seen a range of single event metrics in response to this. We've seen academic studies, the work by ANIMA across Europe, work by Manchester Metropolitan University in particular, that has really looked at community reactions. And I recall being involved in a focus group that was trying to find out how communities responded to noise information. And actually, the metric that actually gained the most community response, the one that made communities say, that reflects my experience, was simply a map of the flight tracks with the numbers of operations that day. It had no noise information on it at all, but it's something that people related to. It looked on a map like something that related to their experience. And so, I think because of that, we really have to think that there isn't a metric, but a suite of metrics that we need to produce. The N60s and the N70s, the number above 60 dB or the number above 70 dB, they've become familiar. And I have to say, certainly in the UK, in sort of recent years, in the last sort of 2 or 3 years in particular, especially in relation to airspace change, our Civil Aviation Authority challenges our airports and our airspace change sponsors to come up with these additional metrics and present them to the public when they're actually sort of making their environmental assessments. But I think there are other things apart from metrics. I think we also really need to consider context. Some of you may have seen this headline. Google airbrushes out emissions from flying. It was a story from this summer. And what it relates to is a climate story where if you've ever tried to book a flight using Google Flights, Google tries to tell you the CO2 emissions associated with a flight. And up until this summer, they had also multiplied that carbon figure by a factor to account for the non-CO2 impacts, the contrails and the other sort of altitude impacts from flying. And this was the information that was presented. They took a decision over the summer to stop doing that, to just produce carbon and nothing else. And when this came to light, you know, the BBC ran this headline that said that Google was, you know, airbrushing out some of the results, and Google was challenged to explain why it had done it. And it had said, well, we've had conversations with the business community, mainly, I think, other flight booking sites rather than the aviation industry. And we decided that this was in keeping with current policy. You know, ICAO so far, you know, good result this summer at its assembly when it set a net zero climate goal, but it set a net zero climate goal based on CO2 emissions only. You know, the UK's Jet Zero strategy is also based on CO2 only. And so it's thought it was in keeping with that policy context. And so that was its justification. And it said that the latest science, if you look at the scientists behind that, they were advising governments that for now the focus should be on CO2 and not non-CO2. So this headline comes out. And then almost on the same day, we have a response from the science community. These are the same scientists that they'd quoted. Both of these happen to be UK scientists, but they are leading authorities on non-CO2. Piers Forster came out and said, you know, maybe a multiplier for aviation CO2 is probably not the best way to account for the warming from contrails, but it's still better than not counting them at all. And Professor David Lee said, exactly, it's rubbish for mitigation, but useful for reporting and public accountability. I'd rather they did it. And this is the point, that in this case, metrics on climate that were suitable for policy are different from those that are suitable for providing information to the public. And the science community was very strong on saying that, you know, you can't hide behind policy metrics. You have to tell the story to the public. And therefore we think it was a mistake. And I think that's an interesting distinction to think about always. Well, not only about what is the question, but who is the audience? And does the audience want to use policy metrics because they are testing perhaps adherence to a policy? Or do they actually want information because they want to be able to relate to it? And I thought that was a really interesting lesson for Google that we could also apply, I think, to our noise thinking as well. So we talked a little bit about context, but if we sort of develop that a little bit, it's true that we are very data rich at the moment when it comes to noise, much more so than we have been in the past, partly because more airports are monitoring, but also because, you know, the apps developed by Schiphol Watch and others allow us to go out and collect our own data as well. And so we have the tools and we have the data, but we're not necessarily getting to see it all. You know, airports aren't necessarily publishing noise contours or other noise information on a regular basis. And when they do, it's often for the previous year. or based on the previous summer. And communities want to articulate a problem that may be very real, it may be seasonal, it may be something that happened last week, but they want the data to actually be able to explain why this is a problem for the community. And so I think we have to actually ask airports and authorities to be more, to make available the raw data that is behind this, so that we can use it in a way with the metrics that make sense to us in a particular scenario, make it available to us, and actually be able to say, articulate the issues and the problems that we want to see. So we think airports should be required to make data from noise monitoring publicly available, and it should make it easier for members of the public to use that and access it. So ensuring good public access to accurate data, we think, would provide a much better platform for engagement and exploring solutions. It would help communities to engage with airports on the basis of a shared understanding, and providing a helpful resource for researchers considering aviation noise issues. And I think that part is also important. There's a couple of health-based projects that we are working on at the moment with the health authorities in the UK and some academics, where they've got access to medical records and public health data, but they need access to the raw noise data in order to correlate the two. And that's quite hard to get. Quite often you have to negotiate it on an airport by airport basis. So that should be more freely available. And so really, that's the transparency point. Really, in conclusion, and I hope I haven't disappointed if you have all come to hear what the single metric is. I've been working on this for 30 years, and I cannot give you a single metric that wraps up all of those issues. But I would say I think it's time that we learned from that Google example, that when we give out information, when airports give out information, that we distinguish between the policy need and the public information need, and that we make available what's relevant in a format that's meaningful to those people. So I'm not dismissing any of the metrics that are out there. I say they all have their reasons, but we can't just simply say, because we use LEQ for a policy compliance, that is the only metric that we use when we have conversations around noise. We need to supplement it. We need to be richer. And I think my final comment, before just sort of giving it back to the chair, is there are also issues around metrics that are technical that I haven't gone into, which I think are very relevant to the future of aircraft noise. And that's really around, the growth in urban air mobility and the increase potentially in sort of low level flights, very close to housing, and the impact that has not just on noise but on vibration. And we're very used to dealing with A-weighted noise and not dealing with vibration, but I wonder whether that becomes much more of an issue. So I think there's some food for thought, and with that I'll stop. I'm very happy to answer questions. Thank you.
May I speak? Thank you very much. I wanted to mention something. My daughter and her family live near an airport, and my grandson, who is 16, is very articulate about noise. And one thing we often fail to do is to realize that the plane that awakens him at 6:40 in the morning gets lost in the averages. And that's the aircraft that intrudes on his sleep. The other point I want to make, I don't know if you're familiar with the citizens now being able to place monitors on their windows to actually measure the level of the aircraft coming over at a specific time, and that data are being collected. So I am working with the group at NYU in New York City on that data. So I think citizens said, enough with those averages that are being picked up by monitors in the neighborhood. I want to know the time of the plane, the model of the plane, and the level of the sound emitted by that plane at my home every single day. So we've reached a new level of metrics. But the thing I started with, my grandson doesn't even have to use that monitor. With his ears, he can tell you the model of the plane, when it came over, and how loud. And it's very sad that the metrics have not fully assessed the impacts on people, because averages don't tell the story. So I think it's going to be the citizens that are going to take this into their own hands, working with the scientists, and they're going to say, this is what happened to me at my home this last week. So I guess you're familiar with Dr. Park's work at NYU, yes? I'm on his board.
I'm not actually, and I wish I was, because it sounds fascinating. And I think you've just managed.
I'll fill you in.
Please do. You've managed to say in 2 minutes what I think I was trying to say in 20. That I think that whilst noise is very much about, you know, policy metrics, we can't tell our story, and unless we can tell our story, it's very hard to engage the politicians to bring about change. And so that's a great example of the way that citizens can be, if you like, empowered to better tell the story in order to get the changes that we want.
Thank you.
Arlene, I don't know if you can see the hands or not, but you've got a couple of hands. You've got Armel Thomas and Mike Gerard there. I'm not sure, Armel, you may want to go on. I'm not sure if Arlene has seen your hand.
Okay, thank you. Well, it's good to see Arlene. It's very good to see Tim. I haven't seen him for quite a long time. The average noise is a little bit like being slightly pregnant. You're pregnant or you're not. There is no average noise. Either you hear it or you don't. I mean, Bridget Bell, and I think she may be with us at the moment, when she's woken up at 4:15 by the Hong Kong flight, it's not average. She's woken up at 4:15, a little bit like Arlene's grandson. So it's absolutely ridiculous to talk about average, and the word average should be banned from noise. Noise is what you hear at the time, and I totally agree with the description of Arlene. You hear it at the time. I mean, I live next to Heathrow Airport. I was just about to go to sleep, and at 3:30, I heard quite a lot of noise, and I thought, what the hell is that? So I got up, and we had a riot because we've got an asylum immigration center next to us, and there is a riot today. So at 3:30 this morning, the helicopters were going like mad all around our home. We knew it was the asylum immigration center because, you know, nothing else would actually make that noise. When my neighbor in Harlington was woken up at 3:30 by an aircraft noise and complained to Heathrow, they said, oh, no, that was Gatwick. Well, actually, that was an aircraft, an engine being serviced. And the next time she had to actually, at about the same time in the morning, she had to put a mobile phone outside the window of a bathroom. And then she eventually said to Heathrow, well, was that at Gatwick or was that at Heathrow? Because there actually lies there, you know, time and time again, and they don't recognize, you know, the noise that we've got. Now, one thing that actually Tim hasn't mentioned, but it's the word respite. We attend with other members who are here today on that conference call, quite a lot of meetings with Heathrow on airspace change and noise forum and all that. And they haven't a clue what is the definition of respite. And I did say to them, well, we had respite during COVID because the airport was nearly closed. So we didn't have any noise. Actually, even the birds were coming back in our garden because there was no noise. You know, the nature had completely changed because there was no noise. But Heathrow Airport doesn't have a definition for respite noise. And for the person who was mentioning 45 flights an hour, I think it was at Lisbon, which makes 1,080 flights per day. We've actually got 1,315 flights per day, or 480,000 a year. That was before COVID. And we certainly know what respite is. Respite is when you don't have any noise and you can hear the birds, you can hear the wind, you can hear the rain. And yet the airport, which is one of the biggest in the world, is actually refusing to explain what respite is. We know what respite is. So, I think respite should actually be talked about more, and we should collectively around the world have a definition. Since the airports are incapable of defining respite, I think one of the work of UECNA should actually be to get together and to find a definition that we can impose on the airports around the world of what we think is respite. And the other thing, while I've got the floor, is actually when people mention engagement. Oh, Heathrow Airport, engage. They don't stop engaging, but they don't listen and they carry on doing what they want. We need meaningful engagement. And there was also something which was mentioned 2 or 3 years ago. It was about the Vienna, I talk about Vienna Convention, but it's not a Vienna Convention. It's a way of being able to speak to between the airports, the governments and the residents, communities, a conflict resolution. Well, we've got lots of conflicts with Heathrow, but we've never had any resolutions. So, I think that's another thing that needs to be discussed. And all together around the world, we need to find conflict resolution to all the problem that we've got by 10% of the world population who annoy 90% of the rest of the world. Thank you.
Thank you.
I think you've got, I'm not sure if you're seeing the hands, Arlene, but I'll help you. You've got Mike Gerard and then you've got Colin. They've got their yellow hands up. So
okay, Mike here. Very, very quick answer. When you ask Google a question, it looks up who you are, what questions you've asked, who's asked similar questions, and what similar answers have there been, and it gives you the answer that it considers is the one that you'd most like to get. So if Tim would like to ask which is the best onion to grow, I'm sure he'd get an answer. That was all.
Colin, can you follow up on that?
It'll be a challenge. My broadband has recovered, so you've got my face this time. I think there was a comment made earlier on about the importance of working together, and that's especially true with respite. So where we live is underneath both the Heathrow and the Gatwick flight path, even though it's a rural area. So what we have is we'll get respite from Heathrow, so Gatwick will fill it, and then vice versa. So we never actually have any respite. And obviously Farnborough is a relatively small component of those two big airports. But I think, from a community and finding solutions point of view, we need to look at things in the whole rather than specifically, because, like the averages and it's noisy or it isn't. You have to consider what people are experiencing rather than what you think is happening.
Absolutely.
Great. Again, Arlene, I think we may want to go on to the next presentation. So, to thank
Okay.
Tim and wish him best in his best in his onion growing, and then maybe move on to Werner's presentation, and there'll be more time for questions after that.
I'll report
Thank
back
you.
on the onions. Thank you very much.